Today I'm going to share with you 5 practical steps that you can follow and get better wide-angle landscape photos. So let's get started. Hello everyone, my name is Toma, Photo Tom here on YouTube, and this channel is all about landscape photography. So if you're interested in this kind of topic, make sure to subscribe for more similar videos. Also make sure to check out my website for instructional videos, my workshops, and my ebook that I'm going to launch this week. Tip number 1 is to take time and explore the place. This is practically a tip that I have for you from the mistakes that I noticed during my workshops. That is the moment when I pay attention to what the photographers around me are doing, because my job with those workshops is to guide the photographers that are with me to get better photos. What I noticed is that people are so mesmerized with the landscape in front of them. Usually it's their first time in that location, and they tend to get fixated on an element, and they're missing not necessarily better opportunities, but maybe other photographic opportunities. In often cases, they don't explore the place, and I think exploring a location allows you to identify potential subjects, identify potential foreground elements, potential geometrical compositions. And maybe it sounds strange and I'm saying geometrical when I'm referring to nature, but my goal when I'm creating my compositions is to have very clear leading lines, and it's almost like I'm trying to create or to frame only some elements of nature that would look maybe like geometrical patterns in some way. So that is why I'm reaching a location with about 2 hours before sunset, and I'm giving the chance to everyone to just feel the place and to explore the place. I'm also arriving at least 30 minutes before sunrise. There is still some light. We have a fixed point, and I can pinpoint some elements because at sunrise we are still in a little bit of darkness. It's a little bit difficult to start exploring the place, but I'm there and I'm offering information, so I'm trying to help. But that first step, try to explore the place and think about how you would photograph different elements that you're noticing by using a wide-angle lens. And now we're moving to tip number 2, and that is to find your subject. You may look at the entire landscape and say, okay, I really like the landscape, when in fact you like how the light is shining on a certain peak or certain other elements. So it's very important for you to ask this question: what am I photographing here? And to give yourself an answer. And I'll show you some of my photos. For example, this one over here, and I'm in Dolomites for this photo, and I'm at Tre Cime di Lavaredo, and I'm looking at the peaks, and those peaks are my subject. But because I'm photographing with a wide-angle lens, and when you're photographing with a wide-angle lens, everything tends to get in your shot, and you need to position your camera in such a way that you take out the elements that are not important for your photo. So in this photo, my subject, my focal point was the 3 peaks in the distance. For this one over here, I'm almost in the same spot. So I took this photo and then I turn around, and this is the view behind me. Another tip would be, as a landscape photographer, to be 360 degrees aware. So in this case, I'm photographing this this refuge over here, and the entire composition starts from the right and goes a little down and points to the refuge over there. In this case, for example, again in the Dolomites, my subject was the mountain in front of me, and I really liked the light that was shining on that mountain. And because I like the I liked the light, I made sure that first I frame the subject in a way that you can notice the light. If the mountain was just a little piece of element in my photo, then it would not look that well. And then I'm exposing and I'm editing the photo in a way that I have an increased contrast, and you can notice that alternation of light and darkness. In this photo over here, I really liked how the peaks in the background are catching the sunrise light, and that was my subject. Over here, the ruins of this stronghold was my subject, and I positioned in such way that the stronghold still has a considerable size, because when you're photographing with wide-angle lens, the wide angle tends to emphasize the foreground elements and to make the background elements smaller. So you need to be careful with how distant from you the subject really is. In this case, the subject was the cave in the distance, and I used the raw power of the water to just lead the way, and I also placed myself over there to give proportion to the landscape. And the subject, it's clearly the tree. The only thing that I had to do was to position in a way that I have this S curve in the trunk of the tree, and it looks really, really interesting. You can photograph a tree from 360 degrees around it, but you need to find a position from where it looks really good. Over here, I was in Norway, in Lofoten Islands, and of course that I loved how the first rays of the sunrise hit the mountain. I also made sure that at the base of the mountain there's a streak, there's a short area of darkness, and that creates a separation. Of course, I liked the reflection and decided to photograph exactly that. Again, in Norway, I really liked the mountain in the distance. The clouds were moving really fast, and I did a long exposure to capture that. And I have these rocks in the foreground that would capture the eye of the viewer and will lead you to the peaks in the background. The reason I did a long exposure was because the small ripples in the water, they didn't look that good, and they kind of broke the composition. Again, over here I'm in Lofoten, and my subject is the mountain in the background that still has light, and I'm in an area of shadow, and I'm creating some leading lines that point to the mountain. Again, I'm doing a long exposure, and the reason for that long exposure in this photo is because the foam of the waves and of the water created a leading line that points to the mountain over there. A normal exposure would have had only the lines in the rock. Tip number 3 is to visualize the photo, and to visualize the photo means that you are planning the photo inside your head. You know you're going to use a wide-angle lens, so you start thinking about the framing and how you would position yourself. Because, as I said, using a wide-angle lens means that almost everything is going to be in your shot. 17 millimeters, for example, on a full-frame body, it's pretty wide. So you need to make some conscious decisions about how you're going to photograph. For example, in this photo over here, well, the subject is the stronghold, but I looked at the tree to the left, and I used that as a counterpoint for the stronghold. And then I'm sitting really low because I found some cool-looking grass, and the rest of the field was empty. And if I was standing up, then there would be a break in the grass, and then the field and the stronghold. And this way I've managed to hide the field and you have your attention only on the tree, the stronghold, and the grass in the foreground. The planning that went into this photo was related to the size and proportion of the place, and that is why I use myself in the shot to give proportion to the place. And I also position myself near the river that has a direction towards the cave, and I also choose an exposure time that would not result in a Milky Way water, but I wanted to capture the raw power of the movement of the water. Over here, the planning was really simple. I saw the light, I waited, and I did a long exposure to calm the surface of the water and have the reflection. I was thinking, okay, the water has some ripples in it, so I need to do a long exposure. And also, the reflection is usually 2 or 3 stops darker than the actual object. So I also used a gradiated filter of 3 stops for the upper part. And these kind of plannings result in better photos. Over here, it was a foggy day. And I know I raised the drone and I went above the fog and saw that everything was clear, the sky was clear. So that meant that when the sun is going to rise, the light of the sunrise will simply light up the fog. So I just stayed there, waited until the sun came out, and that's the beautiful scene that I photographed. Over here I was in the Dolomites and at Lago di Misurina, and I saw the hotel, I saw the mountain in the background. I did some photos during sunset, but then I thought what this scene would look like at blue hour. And at blue hour you have that really beautiful blue look together with some lights from the hotels and the stores from up there. In this situation I was in the cave, and just photographing the place without me over there didn't give a sense of how big the place is. It's not really big, and but it's really important for me to have a silhouette, and that's me over there, to kind of give you a true feel of how the place really is. Over here I was again in Lofoten, and I saw the waves crashing on the rocks, and I used a focal length of 19 millimeters or 17 millimeters, something like that, for this photo. And I captured 2 big boulders in the foreground, and I had 2 big mountains in the background, and I'm trying to get an exposure time that would capture the splash. Tip number 4 is to actually create a composition that would support your subject. So you choose your subject, you thought about it, you planned the shot, and now you are creating a composition that would lead the attention of the viewer to the subject. Over here, I really like this refuge. We are at Cinque Torri, 5 towers in the Dolomites, and I used the direction of the road to point the attention of the viewer towards the refuge over there. I had a foggy forest, for example, in this situation, and you see a trail, and I positioned myself in an area of darkness, and then in the background you see that the trees are having a clearance in their upper part, and there's a little bit of light going inside the forest. So I'm photographing from darkness towards light, and I'm capturing exactly that feeling, and I have the trail that takes you on a journey through the photo to that place. Over here I have a sunset, and I'm using these rocks in the foreground as a starting element, and then on the background I'm having the plain and the sunset. Now I did 2 exposures for this shot because the horizon was too bright because of the sunset, and I blended the exposures and also darkened the sky to have a frame inside the frame created by the areas of darkness to focus your attention. Over here, the main composition, the main leading line is the road. The road kind of starts an S shape, and then the rest of the S shape is, or the end of the S shape is the edge of the hill in the distance, the line that goes towards the house over there. And I'm also using these rocks from one side and the other of the road to frame the road and to guide your attention in the background over there. Also, when you're editing, you can do that. You can create elements that would frame the main leading line. And I'm talking about this a lot in my ebook, because I have 50 case studies over there, and I'm showing you photos and I'm discussing what's the thought process in those photos. In this shot over here, the composition is the trail that continues with the edges of the peaks. And I also have a human figure. It was one of the participants to my workshop. It was a happy accident. He was sitting there, and I thought it looked really well and put the landscape in a good perspective. The composition over here starts with the water flow, and it starts on the lower right and then goes a little bit to the left, and then the water stream transforms in the rock that takes you again to the right. So the composition line starts with water and then continues with the rock, and then the edge of the mountain in the background. Again, this is the same place, and it's a completely different composition. You notice the starting point of the photo, and you have the water, and then you have the mountain in the background. Over here, I really like the light in the background, but I wanted to have some interesting foreground element, and I found these flowers and used them as really big foreground elements. It's the same place. I just stand up, and the light was shining in a different way right now, and I'm having the composition. It starts with the mountain in the shadow from the right, and then it kind of goes down and in the distance towards that point of light. Over here, I have these three rocks in the foreground, and they're creating kind of like an S shape if you connect the dots, and you end up on the peak in the background. Again, I'm inside a cave, and I'm starting with some rocks in the lower left, and the light in the lower left part of the photo is a little dim, and then as you move to the right side of the photo, you see more and more light, and then you see also my silhouette over there that puts everything in perspective. Over here, it's a very simple composition. I'm having some rocks in the foreground, and then the water, and I'm doing a long exposure, and then I have the peak in the background with the sunset light. In this situation, I'm doing a long exposure. I'm in Lofoten Islands, and the rocks are going a little bit to the left, and then my interest point is to the right. So again, I'm creating a zigzag or an S shape. Over here, I use the movement of the eyes. I did a long exposure, and I captured that movement of the eyes, and I used those pieces of eyes as foreground elements to start the composition and move the attention to the mountain in the background. It's the same case here. So as I'm going through the photos, you kind of notice a pattern. You notice the foreground element. For example, over here are these rocks, and then you have the lines of the trees, and the attention of the viewer is taken into the valley. Over here I have a waterfall, and I position myself in a way that I capture the flow of the water and create a S shape from the flow of the water. Over here, a really nice foreground element that leads the attention of the viewer towards the background where there is a little bit more light in the forest, and you have this beautiful feeling. And this one, again in Lofoten, where I had the chance to photograph the northern lights, and I decided I'm gonna place myself there I'm going to use a lantern to shine a light in front of me. This way I become a silhouette, and I'm a counterpoint for the northern lights. And in this way, I think I created a better photo that has a better feeling of the landscape. Tip number 5 is to think about the settings that you're going to use. Why are settings that important when you're photographing with a wide angle lens? Very often you will have elements that are really close to you, and you need to have everything in focus. Another reason is because wide angle lenses tend to emphasize the foreground, so the foreground elements are bigger, seem bigger, and the background elements look smaller. So it's very important to evaluate the distance between you and the subject, and then maybe you plan some editing steps that you need to do in order to compensate for that. So there are a few things that you have to consider, and you have to be very careful. Now let's begin with this photo over here, and the settings are f22 ISO 100 1/25th of a second, and the focal length is 17 millimeters. And if we look at this photo, you're going to notice the flowers in the foreground and then the mountains in the background. It was a little bit windy, and I couldn't do focus stacking because the two photos would look different, and the clouds were moving really fast in the distance. So I choose f22. There are a lot of people that are against f22. I'm not against f22. If the final photo looks okay and it's sharp, then you have no problem with that. The second photo, we have 1/5 of a second f11 ISO 119 millimeters, and for this shot I just wanted to capture that feel that only the background mountains have a little bit of light from the sunrise, and I adjusted the settings accordingly. This one over here, I'm in Lofoten, and I have 79 seconds f11 ISO 119 millimeters. The reason I went for a long exposure was because the foam of the water contributes to the composition. The foam, the white foam, becomes a leading line that points your attention towards the mountain in the distance. Also, the small ripples in the water, I found out that I don't like those small ripples. These small elements, I don't know, for me in that situation didn't look okay. This photo over here, f22 ISO 640 1/50th of a second, 19 millimeters. The reason I increased the ISO was because it was windy, and I have these flowers really close to the camera, so I didn't want it to have a blurred element that close to the camera, so I had to increase the ISO to get an exposure time. I mean, 1/50th of a second, it's not really short, but again, it wasn't very windy. So this photo over here, I'm in the forest, and the settings are 4 seconds f11 ISO 100 17 millimeter. Usually when I'm inside the forest, I'm using my circular polarizer, and inside the forest the light is already not that bright as outside. So with the circular polarizer and by closing the aperture, you can get an exposure time enough to have that milky smooth look of the water. And this photo over here, again in Norway, 101 seconds f11 ISO 100 19 millimeters. And again, the small ripples in the water didn't look okay, and I wanted to have this feeling of ice because it was cold. I edited the photo with a cyan kind of tint, and there's a little bit of a hint of reflections, but that wasn't my goal. My goal was to create that feeling that it's ice over there. It wasn't ice, but I wanted to have that feeling of ice. Okay, and the last photo over here is 25 seconds f 5.6 ISO 819 millimeter focal length. And when I photographed northern lights, I found out that the intensity of the northern lights changes really fast. So I waited up to a certain point when I felt it was at its highest peak, and I decided to have an ISO of 800 to have an exposure of only 25 seconds. I didn't want an exposure too long, because if you're doing really long exposures, you're going to miss a lot of shots. The northern lights move on the sky, and you can have different compositions and different amount of the northern lights in the sky. So I wanted an exposure as short as possible to be able to do as many photos as possible. So that was the video from today. I know it's pretty long, but I hope this was a useful video for you. Check out my website. The link is in the description of this video. You have my workshops, my instructional videos, and by the end of this week, you'll be able to order my ebook on landscape photography. So thanks for watching. Until next time, keep on photographing, because it's the only way to get better. And bye-bye.